So there's an election coming up down here in Australia, but you could be forgiven for not knowing that because we're pretty much the world's least politically relevant country. So it's a pretty good time for a primer on the state of politics in Australia. If you're a foreigner or an Aussie who doesn't really pay much attention to politics, and I wouldn't blame you, you probably know about a grand total of two recent things. The Nazi senator who got an egg smashed on his head, and that our Prime Minister changes every 2 weeks. It's a pretty great resume, isn't it? So we'll get to the Nazi later, but first a quick rundown on how our political system actually works so you can understand why the Prime Minister keeps changing. Australia has a parliamentary system with two houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives. Senators represent their respective states, while MPs or members of parliament represent their respective electorates or districts as they're known in other countries. So at an election, we technically vote for individual MPs and senators. The Prime Minister, who is the head of government, is chosen by the party or the coalition that won the most seats. The PM is then appointed by the Governor-General, who's basically just a useless guy who is the Queen's representative in Australia. Our actual head of state, depending on who you ask, is either that guy or the Queen, even though both of them basically do nothing at all, and if they ever did, there'd probably be riots. We should get rid of him if you ask me. Okay, that might be getting confusing, so really it's just better to ignore the whole Australia is technically still ruled by a hereditary monarch thing. Most of us Australians do too. So in elections, we technically don't actually vote for a Prime Minister. Rather, the PM is picked by the individuals that we elect. In actual practice though, Australia has a really deeply entrenched two-party system, and the two main parties treat their leader as if they're kind of a prime ministerial candidate. But since the PM is technically chosen by Parliament itself, if the ruling party decides that it doesn't like its Prime Minister anymore, they can vote amongst themselves to replace them. And that's how we've ended up with 6 Prime Ministers in 9 years, and only one of those leadership changes was actually decided at an election. So now you know why that's also ridiculous, and you also know enough about our political system that I can move on to the fun part. Our parties and our politicians, and why they're all bad. First, the Liberal Party, because they're currently the ones in government. That name might be confusing for any Americans watching, but they're liberals in like the 19th century economic sense, not in the like liberal in America sense. So basically they're conservatives. They're technically in a coalition with the National Party, but the two parties are tied at the hip and they're basically the same thing anyway. The Liberal Party are right-wing elitists who hate minorities unless they're rich, and they're also huge fans of causing poverty and making us all die in the looming climate apocalypse. They're also lovers of racist dog whistles, the culture wars, nationalist bullshit, even though they're massive neoliberals who are in bed with foreign capital. The Nationals are the same thing except they're from rural areas. What that means in practice is that they're the Liberals but they wear Akubra hats. The current PM up for re-election is Scott Morrison. He's a ridiculous religious conservative who no one likes at all. Some highlights of his political career before he became PM were literally bringing a lump of coal into Parliament and then extolling its virtues in a really weird speech.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The Treasurer knows the rule on crops.
It's coal.
And also virulently campaigning against gay marriage. Exemplary guy, hey? And since actually becoming PM in one of those leadership changes that I talked about last year, he's done little more than spread hateful vitriol and embarrass himself by trying to interact with normal people in public and failing miserably.
Hello, how are you?
Of all Aussie politicians, he's the most likely one to be a lizard in a human suit. And that's saying a lot, trust me. Other Liberal politicians of note include Tony Abbott, former Prime Minister and current MP. He and Morrison share pretty much all the same beliefs, kill the poor, hate the minorities, Christian fundamentalism, all that sort of stuff. They even share the thing where they're both rich elites who seem utterly incapable of interacting with normal people. His most notable moment was being handed an onion on a PR visit to an onion farm and literally immediately taking a bite out of its skin on. Very good. Like, he's a rich bastard who's never actually had to prepare his own food before, so his reaction upon seeing like an onion for the first time was, oh, what the fuck is this? Should I take a bite out of it? Then there's Peter Dutton, who looks so much like a potato that the Chinese Australian media literally calls him Potato Brother. Apart from also being another rich bastard, he's also pretty much a literal fascist. He's used his position as Immigration Minister and Home Affairs Minister to do everything he possibly can to torture refugees, except white South Africans though, because he believes in the white South African genocide conspiracy theory, and he actually gave a speech in Parliament advocating to bring the white South African refugees to Australia. Great. He's also handed himself the power to deport anyone he wants at will, and he's doing his best to turn Australia into a literal police state. So yeah, cool guy. Lastly, Barnaby Joyce, a keen believer in traditional family values, who accidentally impregnated a staffer 18 years his junior and then left his wife for her. Yeah. He also stole a ton of taxpayer money to go on holidays with her, and gave her lots of cushy jobs, again paid for by taxpayer money. Pretty much every Australian politician blatantly misuses public funds like that, but Joyce is definitely one of the more extreme examples. Okay, moving on. So their main opponent in this two-party system is the Labor Party. Don't be fooled by the name though, they haven't been a workers' party for a very long time. They're a party dominated by neoliberal careerists who hijacked the organised labour movement, not actual working class people. I went over that in depth in a previous video, which you can watch if you want to learn more about that. While they're nowhere near as bad as the Liberal Party, that's not exactly a high bar, is it? They're never ever going to say anything bad about capitalism, for example, because they're interested in upholding it, of course. Some people do like to say that they're leftist, but they only really look leftist in comparison to the ridiculous conservative Liberal Party. They still at least aren't opposed to public services, but they always make sure that the private sector gets that cut from everything. The biggest problem with them, aside from the whole neoliberalism thing, is that they just play things as safe as possible all the time. Rather than, say, working to try and make a good idea popular, like, say, what Bernie Sanders has been doing in the US with universal healthcare, which everyone wants there now, they instead oppose or ignore things until they see an opportune time to come out in favour. A great example of this is gay marriage. While in government from 2007 to 2013, they flat out opposed gay marriage. But then in 2017, they came out strongly in favour of it just because they could use it as ammunition against the Conservatives. So quite often, really important issues that many people want on the agenda are opposed by the Liberals and just ignored, or also opposed by the Labor Party, while the people who are affected by these issues deal with the consequences of their inaction. Then 10 years later, they finally come out in favour and act like they were the ones behind it all along. And while doing all of this, they constantly criticise minor parties who try to push them further to the left. Okay, so now they're politicians. Well, since they're kind of just your generic, boring, lowercase l liberals, there's not really much interesting to say about them. They don't really have anyone uniquely bad like the Liberals do, but they also don't really have anyone worth getting excited about. Their leader and candidate for Prime Minister is Bill Shorten, who comes from the right-wing faction of the Labor Party. He's another rich guy. He got into politics as a teenage student and tried to run for MP pretty much right after graduating. He's a great example of an inauthentic political careerist. Aside from that, he's also notable for being an ex-union boss who was known for negotiating deals with businesses that favoured the business and screwed over the workers. It's not very inspiring there. Since becoming leader of the opposition, he's been trying to rebrand himself a bit as like the voice of the working class and all that, while at the same time only really proposing half measures. And you can also bet that once in government he wouldn't deliver on half those half measures anyway. But still, he's not from the Liberal Party. And after 6 years of Liberal government, that is something that gets us excited just by itself. Anything but the Liberals, basically. And that's really what the problem with the Labor Party is. They pretty much just go with the flow. And as user Susie M said in the comments of one of my videos, we're all so exhausted by the Liberal Party and so relieved to get rid of them that once Labor is in government, we just kind of shut up and don't really do anything to push them to be better. So they get away with it, at least until their impotency results in them losing an election to the Liberal Party. And of course, Labor and their supporters love to blame more leftist third parties, such as the Greens, for their failures. Even though Australia has preferential voting, which means, if you vote for a third party, your vote will go to Labor before it goes to the Liberals anyway. So speaking of those minor parties, let's talk about them. The only influential kind of leftist, but not really third party, is the Greens. In Australian terms, they're leaders of the gay, leftist, cultural Marxist conspiracy, but in reality, they're just social democrats who never say anything bad about capitalism, just like Labor. Still, they are at least equal or better than Labor on pretty much every issue. They just obviously don't have near as much power. They're especially good on climate change, which is pretty much the most important issue facing the world right now, so that's pretty good, I guess. As far as actual leftist parties go, they're all tiny and pretty much none of them have any chance of winning a seat, nor do they have any seats right now. So yeah, so most of them just aren't even worth mentioning, sadly. I will give a shout out to the Victorian Socialists though. They're a new minor party who are run by actual leftists, actual working class people with actual organising experience. They'll be getting my vote, but there's pretty much no chance that they'll really be doing much more than just feeding preferences to the Greens. But hopefully they stick around and grow more in the future, because Australia desperately needs actual leftists. We also have lots of independents and people from minor parties in Parliament, but pretty much all of them are right-wing. And a lot of their parties have dumb names too, like really dumb names, so dumb that they're funny. Like, I have them written down here, let's see. One was called Nick XENOPHON Team. They're gone now, but that's the dumbest name I've ever heard in my life. And there was this other racist right-wing politician named Jackie Lambie, and her party was called the Jackie Lambie Network. And even though she was a racist conspiracy theorist who believed that China was going to invade Australia, people still lauded her as some sort of authentic working class voice. That's how desperate people are for just someone in our parliament who isn't a rich asshole. Anyway, so on to the even more depressing part. the crypto and the actual Nazis, and there are sadly a lot of them. There's One Nation, who have been a party of out-and-out racists for about 25 years now. They're the fourth biggest party after the Greens. Their biggest support base is in Queensland, which aside from having tons of natural wonders that are in real danger of being destroyed by climate change, is basically the Texas of Australia. So One Nation got their start yelling about Asian immigrants in the 90s, and they've since moved on to complaining about cultural Marxism and Muslims. Their leader is Pauline Hanson, a hateful beast of a person. She's been elected to parliament a couple of times, and her policy agenda can be summed up as basically whites good, everyone else bad, straight people good, and everyone else bad. Oh, and also climate change isn't real. That's another big one. She recently tried to pass a motion through the Australian Senate which said that it's okay to be white, which also the Liberal Party supported her on.
I would also hope the Senate does the right thing and acknowledges it is indeed okay to be white.
So yeah, that's depressing, isn't it? Now on to the egghead. His name is technically Fraser Anning, I guess. He was a member of One Nation. You see, when a senator from a party is removed from the parliament in some way, they're replaced by the next senator in line from their party. So when the last One Nation senator was kicked out, Anning, who is a total nobody moron, replaced him, even though he only got literally 19 votes in the last election. Great system. In his first speech in Parliament, which was written for him by a literal writer of fascist political theory, he called for a final solution to immigration.
The final solution to the immigration problem.
He then quit One Nation and formed his own party, which doesn't deserve to be named, apparently because One Nation wasn't racist enough for him. He's been spreading vile fascist garbage since, while also mingling with the literal Nazi crowd. And he also got an egg smashed on his head, which was, to be honest, the only good thing that I can remember happening in Australian politics for a very long time. Luckily, he's almost certain to lose his seat in the Senate in the coming election. Thank fucking God. The fifth biggest party is sadly the dumbest thing you could possibly imagine. There's this gross old conservative mining magnate, Clive Palmer. He made his own political party and has spent $60 million on advertising in a bid to win a seat in the Senate. This is all while he literally owes the government $70 million, and he was convicted of underpaying his workers by $7 million, and he's yet to actually pay any of that money back. Well, my battery's about to run out, so I think I'll come back and finish this tomorrow. I'm back. So Clive Palmer's bought so much TV ad space that his ads show in every single commercial break. His ads play before every single YouTube video, and you literally can't walk 2 feet without seeing a billboard with his face on it. Seriously, it seems like every damn billboard in the country is Clive Palmer's face and it says, "Make Australia great," or "Fast trains 500 kilometers an hour," whatever that means. Bad news though, his strategy is actually unfortunately working. His party is polling 4th or 5th depending on the poll, which is ludicrous for like a nobody party. So he's almost certain to win a seat in the Senate, and the Liberal Party is also making deals with him, so his other candidates might even win their seats too, especially since he's running in Queensland, which has a soft spot for old white conservatives and mining. So yeah, apparently if you're rich, you can just bankroll a vanity project to get elected to Parliament by shoving ads in everyone's face and it will work. Cool. There's a bunch more minor right-wing crank parties, far too many to count really. Some already have people in Parliament, and even the ones who don't are still quite visible. The Liberal Party is also so desperate to stay in power that they're making preference deals with these borderline or actual Nazis. A preference deal is when you say, well, hey, I'll put you second, and you put me second, so that if you lose, I get your votes. And the worst thing is, there's really not many leftist equivalents to these right-wing minor parties right now. There's no leftist independents or minors who even hold a seat in Parliament, other than the Greens, I guess, if you want to call them leftists. And none have any chance of winning a seat at the election. So things are looking pretty grim for the Aussie left right now, I'd say. There are at least some independents running as single-issue climate candidates to try and unseat climate change deniers. One of them, Zali Steggall, is polling really well against the aforementioned Tony Abbott, so she might actually be able to defeat him. But other than on climate change, she's basically just another conservative who agrees with the Liberal Party on everything. So not even remotely a leftist, but still, Tony Abbott losing his seat would at least be a lot of fun. As for the big issues going to this election, well, I'd say number one is just economics in general. Material needs. Everything is really expensive, and our wages, despite being high in global terms, are still kind of inadequate. We have a ton of long-term unemployed people, and it's incredibly difficult to find work once you're out of it. And at the same time, unemployment benefits are not even anywhere near enough for someone to just survive off. Last I checked, they haven't increased in real terms in 20 or 30 years. Rent is also ridiculous. Housing costs about 10 times more than it did 30 years ago, to the point that like a vacant block 10 kilometers from the city center will sell for over $1 million, and public services have been cut to the point they're woefully inadequate. You know, all that sort of stuff. I feel like this is a shared experience of a lot of other so-called developed countries right now. So TLDR, we need socialism. Number 2, I would say, is climate change. Australia, and especially the northern parts that have economies based around mining and natural resources in general, have lots of people who deny climate change, either out of stupidity, tradition, short-sightedness, selfishness, or all of the above, or also because they're bought out. On the other side though, a lot of people are increasingly demanding real climate action. So even though we're a small player in the grand scheme of things, we might be able to push our government to make an example for the world. Or maybe everything will just go to shit. Number 3, because it's been made a big issue again by racist dog whistle politics and the far right, is immigration and the associated culture war stuff. And sadly, while they're not out and out racist, Labour is still pretty bad on this stuff. For example, they advocate for strong borders, their words, not mine, and plan to continue running offshore refugee concentration camps. And yes, you heard that right. Australia has offshore refugee concentration camps. Manus Island and Nauru. Look them up. But hey, at least blatantly racist immigration hysteria is not actually a part of their election strategy, like the Liberals and their associated buddies. I mean, the Liberals just announced that they're going to freeze refugee intake if they win the election. So it's pretty hard to be anywhere near as bad as they are. Okay, so there's the basic rundown of the present political landscape. Now what's actually going to happen in the election? Well, polling is making it look like Labour is going to win, which is certainly a lot better than the alternative, but really anything can happen. But I think it would be a pretty big indictment of Australian voters if this government was actually re-elected, as they've been a total shambles. There's been 6 years of 3 different prime ministers, and pretty much nothing has gone well at all, not even in neoliberal terms. If they are re-elected though, with all of their recent pandering to fascists, well, we're screwed. So here's what I think is going to happen. Labour will win and govern with the Greens, but at the same time, minor right-wing parties are going to gain a lot of ground. Labour will likely end up being Labour and just do whatever their strategists tell them is safe, but that won't be enough to curb the rise of the crypto-Nazis. And I really fear that in the next election after this one, the crypto-fascists, the fascists, and the crank conservatives will have grown so much that they're going to hold the balance of power in Parliament. Unless, of course, Labour actually tries to be a little bit radical in policy this time around. Or maybe some of the minor leftist parties like the Victorian Socialists manage to grow and win a seat and provide us with a viable minor leftist party. Maybe they could even become the Australian Socialists. Ooh. Personally though, I'm getting the hell out of this dumpster fire and immigrating, so I clearly don't have much faith in the future. So yeah, there you go, that's Australian politics for you. Now you know a fair bit about what stuff's like in the most irrelevant country in the world. I'm gonna get up and leave now because talking into a camera in a public park is super embarrassing. Oh, and a special thanks to my patrons, especially Daniel S., Freelance Policeman, Kira, B, Lord Hawkins, and Tija. Bye.